best way to make chemo and radiation more effective? Nothing. Literally nothing. Fasting is the way to make chemo and radiation more effective. So I started researching this wonderful man named Dr. Walter Longo. He works in gerontology research at USC. He is an Italian who came to the United States because he actually wanted to be a rock star. So in this documentary called The Science of Fasting on Amazon, you should watch it, it shows him like playing his guitar, and that was his dream. That's why he came to the States. So now he's become, though, this rock star of cancer research and of fasting research for all kinds of different diseases, from MS to cancer to rheumatoid arthritis and all kinds of things. So he's like kind of my hero. So I came across a study of his where they had all these mice in a study, injected them with different kinds of skin and breast cancers, and then gave them a ton of chemotherapy. Like, it should have killed a human, and they gave it to these mice. So half of the mice were fasted, and were fasted because, of course, they don't choose what they eat. The researchers are like, and you're not eating, and you're going to eat. So half of the group was fasted, and half of the group was not. And if you watch the documentary, you will see the visual of these outstanding results, because what they found was that fasting significantly increased the survival rate. So Dr. Longo, in his documentary, says he was out of town when the initial research was taking place, and his researchers called him and they're like, none of the fasted mice died. They're all alive. And he was so shocked. He's like, well, run the experiment again. And they kept running it over and over again, and found that the fasted mice survived. And they didn't just survive, they had a way higher rate of cancer-free survival. And in the video, you see there are a few mice that survived the just chemotherapy, and they used doxorubicin and cyclophosphamide, both of which I had the pleasure of taking in. So that was especially interesting to me. I'm like, those are my drugs. I need to learn more about this. So the two mice that they show in the video that survived, they're kind of in their cages. They're like barely moving. They literally have their faces in the corner of their cages. And the mice that were fasted were totally normal. They're running around, they're moving, they didn't have cognitive impairment, they didn't have organ damage, they had less tissue damage in general. So we see this huge implication, and then they started doing all kinds of other studies with different chemo drugs, different kinds of cancers, and while some of them varied because different kinds of cancers are so different, they still found that fasting significantly increased survival rate and long-term outcomes in the mice that were in these studies. And so the findings and implications are, to me, even more interesting than the results, because differential stress sensitization is talking about making cancer cells more susceptible to the oxidative damage of chemotherapy, whereas differential stress resistance means that healthy cells can actually resist that damage in a state of fasting. So similar to how our ancestors were able to survive, the healthy cells go into this protective mode, which I just think is amazing when you see the genetic presentation of cancer cells versus healthy cells. In a state of feeding, the cancer cells are really strong because they have these T regulatory cells that basically protect and hide them from the immune system. And when I'm explaining, I'm using way more like scientific jargon right now than I would with patients, but when I'm explaining it to patients, I say, basically the cancer cell is wearing a jacket. And the jacket is camouflage, and they're like, no, immune system, I'm not that bad, don't worry about me, I'm fine. And heme oxygenase 1 is an enzyme that is inside of the mitochondria of the cancer cell, which I think to be kind of like the buttons of the jacket. So once the buttons of the jacket come off because low glucose weakens the mitochondria of the cancer cell, it's like a strong wind comes by and the jacket flies off, and all of a sudden the cancer cell is like, don't look at me, I'm naked. And then the immune system and chemo are able to target it in a much more effective way. So that, I think, is such an amazing thing about what percent of that pie chart can we take a hold of as patients to make chemo more effective. And not just more effective, but less toxic for us as well. So in their findings, they were looking at also a fasting mimicking diet, which is FMD, and they basically decreased glucose, decreased protein, decreased calories for 4 days and did all kinds of blood work, and found that, of course, the blood glucose level comes down, which is great, since then we're cutting off the primary fuel source for cancer cells. But also that IGF-1 went down as well, which is such a tricky thing because when we're in a state of growth, like as children, we need insulin-like growth factor to be able to make healthy cells and to grow. But when we have cancer, IGF-1 is a very high risk factor because then we're not just creating more healthy cells, we're also creating a lot more cancer cells. So when you bring that number down, then you're basically thwarting the growth of the cancer cell. So they found that 4 days of the fasting mimicking diet was as effective as water-only 2-day fast. And then the part that I love the most is that stem cells began to regenerate. And they were not looking for that, they weren't expecting that to happen, but that is what they found. And so that made them think, oh my gosh, there are huge implications here for rebuilding the immune system after chemotherapy and radiation. And in my experience, both with people that I know who have had cancer multiple times, as well as those who have had cancer once but still can't get healthy, we know that the immune system is hugely important for our overall survival. So if we have the cheapest way ever to rebuild the immune system, like that's a magic bullet, and I think creates an experience where we can actually become way less likely to have recurrence if we start to implement something like a 4-day fasting mimicking diet every few months. Or I still do water only fast like once a month. Sometimes I try to do it once a week for 24 hours and just kind of let my body do its work. And then the lymphocyte count went up after refeeding. So when you're not eating, the lymphocyte count goes down. But then they found when they refed the mice, their lymphocyte count went up by like 30%, which is really significant when you're dealing with a lot of possible neutropenia. So this is my rock stars quote here, like every other cell, cancer cells need energy to survive and keep growing. But cancer cells are fairly inflexible about how they produce that energy, which gives us a way to target them. So this is definitely the piece that I'm the most passionate about because it's so effective. It's clinically and scientifically effective. It is hard, so I will definitely say that. I definitely had days where I was like, I need to go to an Airbnb where there's no food in the cupboards because I feel so strongly about doing this, and it's a really hard thing to do when you're around people that are eating. But when I learned about this, I had 6 rounds of chemo. I did EPOC, so it was a 96-hour inpatient. And for the last 4 rounds, I fasted for 48 to 60 hours before each of those rounds. And my blood work still looked great every time, like looking at glucose and electrolytes and all kinds of stuff and potassium, and it was all really stable because our bodies have all of these nutrients because we're overeating all the time. We have all these nutrients that are stored in our bodies, which our innate intelligence just blows my mind, that when we're in these states of fasting, whether it's a chosen fast or an involuntary famine, our bodies know what to do. They're designed to survive. Some other really interesting research. Yeah, wow, I feel for Mike because he'd like come out and sitting in the backyard and I'm like, dude, doxorubicin and cardiotoxicity and collagen peptides and just all this stuff. So these are some of the other studies, which I'll send all of you some links to these studies, but that fasting increases the efficacy of chemo, that it limits specifically the cardiotoxicity of drugs like doxorubicin. And then this is, I think, so amazing. This is a slide that shows you the difference between a control group and the fasted group for various side effects. So I had round 1 when I didn't make any special changes, and the 2 recovery weeks they were terrible. Like, I thankfully didn't throw up, but I had horrible abdominal pain, constipation, my whole body felt like a bruise. I was so exhausted. Like, within 30 minutes of getting out of the hospital, headache, sore throat, couldn't hardly stand up to take a shower, which it had been 5 days, so like I was desperate to take a shower after being in the hospital. So I have that as kind of my personal control group experience. And then when I saw this chart, I thought, oh my gosh, this is completely true with my experience of fasting before chemotherapy and how it decreased the side effects so significantly. So we don't need to go through all of those, but I will say that vomiting and diarrhea, the fasting group had none of that, and those two things alone are wildly unpleasant. So if we could even just decrease those, like major, major victory. But people say, but don't lose weight, because if you lose weight, you're gonna have to stop doing chemo. I'm like, yes, you do lose a little bit of weight doing a 2-day fast, that is true. However, you gain it back very quickly. And my personal take is that I would rather lose weight and make chemo more effective than be in the class of people that is continuing to feed their cancer while they're trying to fight it. That is counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, so yes, I would rather lose some weight and increase my chances of cancer-free